Okay.
I'm going to mute myself.
Okay, good. So, hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this enterprise. It's a super interesting and also somewhat different experience for me and probably for a lot of you. I've got an hour allocated to go through some basic content on governance research and governance ideas with a focus on knowledge, information, data, and collective and community environments. The slide deck here is relatively dense with text, so I won't hit every single point on every single slide, but the slides will be available and accessible to everyone after the fact for reference purposes. And if you have questions that don't occur to you during the talk, you can always circle back either in this platform or separately, and I'm happy to chat with people inside or outside the environment as well. So start off with a very, very quick overview of where we're going. I have a picture of my friend Scott, who's a symphony conductor, is kind of to orchestrate the entirety of the hour. Sort of high level, general conversations about what governance is, what I think of when I refer to governance, the relationship between governance and law, which is sometimes something that people miss, but something that's an important step. The governance questions and concepts relevant to and coming out of conversations about knowledge, information, data, moving from problem identification to strategies and solutions. What does the array of solutions look like? What are the tools? What are the strategies? What are the tactics? How do they go together? What kind of good questions do we all need to be asking ourselves? If there's time, I hopefully will get to some very, very brief case studies from my own research, sort of illustrating how these things go together. And then there's a quick wrap up with some key points that I at least think are really important to keep in mind. Start off with just a very, very quick note about myself. I'm a law professor. I teach in Pittsburgh at the University of Pittsburgh. I have a background as a practicing lawyer in Silicon Valley for about 10 years, but I've now been a law professor in Pittsburgh for about 25 years. I come to governance from a background as an IP lawyer. Mostly copyright, trademark, trade secret, a little bit of patent law, but I'm not a patent law. From IP then into law and technology, from law and technology into the field that my colleagues and I call knowledge commons, which we'll talk a little bit more about later on in the slide deck. Knowledge commons is a species of governance. And I'm also interested in thinking about governance and the future of law, future of legal systems. So I have a podcast and I do other things as well. But I think it's important to understand my angle on these governance questions because people come to governance from a lot of different backgrounds. My background starts with law and technology, and then expands outward in a pretty broad way from there. Okay. Governance. What do we mean by governance, or what do I mean by governance? I take a pretty broad view, so trying to capture a lot of different concepts and how they relate to one another. Generally speaking, when I say governance, what I mean are human systems for enabling people in groups to get along. People have diverse preferences, people have diverse practices, people have to have systems for living together, for working together, for combining, for managing conflict based on things that have happened in the past, and for cooperating and planning to map out things that are going to happen in the future. So that's not just a set of rules. There's rules, but there's also other things going on. And the focus here is on governance as an institution. So when I start talking about governance, I don't start talking about individuals. I don't start talking about individual rights or duties. I start talking about how the institution, how the system as a whole operates, all the different inputs, all the different mechanics inside, all the different outputs. The group, the institution, might be formal. So it's easy to imagine formal institutions that have governance. Countries, cities, companies, other formal entities are obvious examples of formal institutions. But when I think of governance, I also include informal institutions. So I think of communities of interest or communities of practice, people who share professional backgrounds, people who are alumni of a college or a university. People who are lawyers, people who are journalists, people who are roboticists have common backgrounds and trainings. Even if they didn't all go to school together, they don't all necessarily work together. They have similar outlooks, they have similar histories, they might have professional organizations or informal gatherings to help them connect up to with one another. That's an example of a system that has governance. Governance might be formal, so law, rule of law, legal institutions are examples of formal governance. Corporate governance, rules for companies, those are also examples of formal governance. But there might be informal governance. So we think of licenses for open source software programs or open content communities. Social norms, which may be governance or part of governance, are often very important, but they're informal and they're not necessarily documented, but we have to understand what they are and how they work. All of these things, informal and formal governance, formal and informal institutions, they may go together. So when we're looking at a given ecosystem or environment or ecology, what you're trying to do is trying to figure out what the governance is by taking apart the separate contributions of formal and informal groups, formal and informal governance, rules, and how they all link up. Do they link up in layers? Do they link up in hierarchies? Do they link up in Venn diagrams? What kind of interdependencies are there? What kind of infrastructures are there? What lives on top of the infrastructures? Some of this is very contemporary and present. Some of it is historical and cultural. So you're always thinking about the history, the influence of history, the influence of path dependence, the influence of training and education, community background, identity of various sorts, and how those contribute to the functioning of a contemporary governance system. And let us not forget the very, very important contributions that technologies and technological systems contribute. The technologies might themselves be infrastructures. The technologies might guide people to behave in certain ways or prohibit people from behaving in other ways, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill, but technology is part of this mix as well. Right. So just as a quick example, obviously we're in the OYA platform today. The OYA platform is new to me. It's probably new to a lot of you. It has a lot of interesting functions and features that are influencing how we behave in this communications conference environment that is contributing to, in some ways, how the environment is productive and good, and in some respects, how the environment is different and therefore maybe not as optimal as some other video conferencing environments. Law. So let me shift from governance, the macro topic, to law, which is sometimes something that gets overlooked. Governance, we often think of governance as something that groups produce themselves, right? So self-determination, a group setting its own rules. But sometimes rules come in, sometimes there are elements of governance that come in from the outside, things that the group, in its effort to be self-determined, can't avoid, right? Law is something that is often mandatory. Think constitutional law in the US. It is supposed to be mandatory. You can't, at least in theory, you can't opt out of constitutional law. So constitutional law is somehow part of the system of group self-determination, right? So let's call this the rule of law. The rule of law is a concept. It's not a specific thing. The rule of law is in the, call it in the ether, it's in the air. It's something that we have to think about and take account of when we're talking about governance, because we have to imagine, how do rule of law concepts affect what we see when we talk about the specifics of governance? So there's some aspects of rule of law that are obvious, right? So rule of law is rules that operate with some universality, consistency, predictability, transparency, accountability, right? The rules of the system are supposed to be neutral. They're not supposed to be dictated or applied based on bias, identity, power, money, and so forth. The rules are meant to be encoded in some public way, so you know what they are. They are supposed to be addressed usually to the individual citizen or resident, right? So rule of law concepts turn out to be in evidence in institutions, right? Legislatures, courts, those are kind of the institutions that advance the rule of law. But the benefit of the rule of law is supposed to benefit individuals, right? It's supposed to make life fairer. It most to make life predictable. In the best case, rule of law principles help us be healthier and wealthier and more secure and have more productive families. And there's a variety of substantive goals that rule of law helps advance. I just want to identify law and legal systems as an element here, because sometimes when we talk about governance, we skip over rule of law, and I think it's important to include it. Rule of law values, rule of law practices are illustrations of governance in action. They're parts of governance. Governance is a macro category. Rule of law is a subsidiary category, in my view, but it's a very critical subsidiary category. So how do we take governance, this macro category, how do we start to put it into action in the context of knowledge, technology, information, data, right? So contemporary, really, really critical problems, right? So the obvious problem that everybody's already acquainted with is that technology, information, data, we often assume, with good reason, that they are immaterial, they're intangible. Now, we know in practice, of course, that technology and information have both intangible attributes and also tangible attributes, right? So machines are still machines, even if they're computers. Machines have to live somewhere, servers have to sit somewhere, power supplies, cooling supplies, and so forth, all of that has to live somewhere. So we have a combinations of intangibility and tangibility, but that in itself is a distinctive attribute of this environment. Those combinations of intangible and tangible resources are changeable. We can influence what's immaterial and what's material. We can change those in ways that we'll call it the traditional or classic environment is more or less fixed. When we're talking about material objects in a classic physics, Newtonian physics way, talking about land and houses and oceans and countries, it's hard to re-engineer the physics of an automobile. A car is a car. Either it doesn't exist or it does. But once it exists, the car is a car. It will evolve, will change, it will decay over time. But there's a kind of given presence to traditional material technology. But with modern IT and computer code and digital assets, we make them up. We configure them. We can create them. We can delete them, at least in principle. And so that I call that the plasticity of technology and knowledge means that governance concepts have to be rethought and reimagined in some respects. So when we talk about governance as groups determining themselves, borrowing from rule of law, but also imagining their own rules as governance, they are to a significant degree in a world where older precedents, older histories, older patterns of governance do not automatically apply. So what does that mean in practice? So that's a lot of windup. Here's the pitch, right? Governance relates to achieving some objectives. The group has goals. The group has goals. Those goals need to be shared somehow within the group. They might be values, they might be practices. Of course, there may be more than one goal for governance within the group. Those goals may be social, the goals may be cultural, they may be political, they may be economic, but somehow there is some objective or destination that the group is trying to achieve, and governance is its set of strategies for getting there. That implies a very important feature, which is that governance usually requires some level, not absolute level, but some level of social or organizational cohesion. There needs to be some baseline agreement on what the goals are. They don't have to be too specific necessarily, but they shouldn't be so general and broad and vague that it's hard to understand what they turn into when you try to operationalize them. Right. So before we get into governance specifics and governance strategies, there's a kind of foundational layer that's really, really critical. Right. Does everybody agree on why we're here in the group? The group might be small, the group might be large. The larger the group, the more difficult that organizational cohesion might be. And the larger the group, the more you're going to recognize the influence of things like history, culture, identity, language, ritual, myth, right? All of those intangible, sort of humanistic kind of resources are things that help connect us to each other, help bind us together as groups, even if we're a large organization or a large group, even if we're spread across a big space, even if we're distributed across time, right? This generation connecting to the last generation or 2 generations ago. There might be a shared history where we're all in a kind of governance alignment at a very fundamental level. Right. So governance is directed to goals. We are looking at governance and goals in the context of knowledge, technology, and data, which are very funky, fluid, human created things. And that means we need to get into the weeds to understand how we turn those broad concepts into practice. Right. So this is what brings me to the research that I've done for the last 15 years with a couple of other people, what we call knowledge commons. So I've got the covers of a series of books that I have co-edited with others. The workshop on knowledge commons at knowledge-commons.net is where you can dive into the details of all this stuff. But the idea of knowledge commons is governance of shared knowledge or information resources in some communal or collective setting. Like, how does governance work? When what you're doing is you're governing shared knowledge in some communal setting. What we do is we get into the data, we get into the empirics, right? This is not a philosophical or ideological question. This is an empirical question, right? Take case studies, do a systematic analysis of the case studies, generate outcomes and hypotheses, iterate and do more. Right. So these books are collections of case studies, some of them having to do with privacy and security, some of them having to do with actually market capitalism. The most recent one that we've got, it's in press right now, is about smart city technology. The first book, Governing Knowledge Commons, took a big, broad swing at a lot of different things: medicine, public health, cultural phenomenon. There's a chapter about roller derby, research science. It really tried to cover the landscape of the different kinds of areas where these knowledge commons governance concepts come out. So what do we look at when we're studying these cases, when we're trying to understand what the key governance concepts are? What are they? What is our strategy? We look at a number of different checkboxes. So I'm going to list them here, and then I'm going to go through them in a little bit more detail in the bulk of the presentation. One, the resources themselves. When we're talking about governance of knowledge and information, what do we mean? What are knowledge resources? What are information resources? What are data resources? What are aligned or parallel resources that we have to take account of? Where are the resources centralized? Where are the resources distributed? Where are they stored? How are they shared? Where are they contributed? Where are they used? Two, social dilemmas. A dilemma is essentially a fancy social science word for a problem. I'm going to get into some more detail about that in a moment, but resources in the knowledge area are problematic, possibly because they are shared, right? The fact that a given resource can be accessed by more than one person at the same time, that generates conflict, that generates problems. We want to make sure that those problems can be resolved. Governance is there to help us resolve the problem or to help resolve the dilemma relative to the knowledge resource. So we have to understand what the resource is. We have to understand what the dilemmas are. Third, the dilemmas and the resources and the governance exist in some collective or communal setting. Let's talk about what the community is. Who are these people? How did they get there? Why are they there? Who gets included? Who gets excluded? Who's in charge? Who else participates and how? What are the rules that the community develops and uses, right? That's a fourth category. What are the rules themselves? I remember I mentioned informal rules, formal rules. How do those go together? Polycentricity is the next category. I'll talk about that in a minute. But the idea of polycentricity is that governance exists in multiple sections, multiple groups, multiple strategies at the same time. You don't necessarily have a single governance system. You might have multiple governance systems that apply to the same community. So you have to be able to document those and how they interact with one another. Feedback loops are critical, as they always are in systems analysis, right? So how does the governance that resolves dilemmas, how does that contribute to a better community? How does that contribute to better or fairer or more productive generation of resources? Where are the gaps in the feedback loops, as well as where are the positives in the feedback loops? And then last of all, how do we know whether it works, right? There has to be a category that says outcomes. Are we doing the right thing? Is governance productive? Can governance be improved? Are there gaps? Are there harms? Are there costs? We have to take account of all those things. So this is basically the overlaying scheme that we use to do our case study analysis of knowledge sharing governance in these books. So some people listening to all this to this point will pause and say, wait a minute, I know this woman, Elinor Ostrom. Lynn Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for Economics back in 2009 because she wrote this super famous book called Governing the Commons, which is all about commons governance and shared resources. And then she and Charlotte Hess a little bit later wrote a book called Understanding Knowledge as a Commons, which took the governing the commons ideas and sort of introduced them to the knowledge space. So if you're acquainted with Ostrom, or if you've heard of Ostrom, you might think, well, didn't Ostrom actually answer all these questions? Shouldn't I simply be giving a lecture and a presentation about Ostrom? And so the answer is no and yes. Right. So Ostrom is a useful starting point for you all in governance. It's a useful starting point for me. Why? Because Ostrom addressed the classic tragedy of the commons, right? The idea that if you put a shared resource out there for people to use, people will go to town. They will, the classic metaphor is the grazing meadow in the center of the New England town, and the 18th century American farmers who would graze their sheep on the meadow, and as a result of there being no rules, each farmer would overconsume the meadow. The sheep would eat all the grass. Call it a tragedy of the commons, because the common resource in the middle would be overconsumed, and you'd lose all the grass because there would be no rules. And Ostrom, with his empirical research program, for which she won the Nobel Prize, demonstrated empirically, lots of case studies, that the tragedy of the commons is often a myth. That in fact, people can cooperate, they can solve the tragedy of the commons, they can develop governance, they can solve their social dilemmas. And other researchers in other fields have made similar arguments from an empirical standpoint. And Ostrom came up with what are known famously as these 8 rules for successful commons governance. So that's good, because our research today on knowledge is very much using that same style, right? Identify social dilemmas, figure out whether governance can be effective. Can the dilemmas be overcome? Can people cooperate in communities? Our style of thinking is very much inspired by and in parallel with what Ostrom did. However, Ostrom did not really dive into technology, knowledge, and data. As a practical matter, her work was all about physical resources, or what she called biophysical resources, fisheries, forests, pastures, right? Trees, fish, and water and land. Even though she wrote Understanding Knowledge as a Commons at the end of her career, that's really more of a teaser. It really didn't get into the details of any of this. And number 2, Ostrom was very skeptical that legal rules had anything to do with this. So that's one of the reasons why I highlighted the rule of law earlier on, is that Ostrom was very skeptical that people in communities governing their own resources needed to rely on the law. And again, maybe it's my bias as a lawyer, but you look at knowledge and information and data, and you think, well, IP law is right there in the middle. You can't study governance of knowledge and data and information without understanding what IP law is doing. Sometimes IP law is doing good things. Sometimes IP law is doing bad things, but you have to understand what IP law is doing in the middle there. And that's something that's very different than what Ostrom taught. So we've created our own empirical strategy that is in parallel with what Ostrom did, but with these key differences. Different sectors, different areas of focus, slightly different emphases in terms of what we study. Okay, so I'm going to go quickly through the different buckets of research. This is highlighting elements of governance. If you're trying to understand how to look at a system and say, where are the governance needs? What is governance doing? This is how you take apart the system to get to the subsidiary elements, right? And then at the end of this, I'll start to put them back together again with some recommendations and strategies for what to do going forward, right? So step 1, what are the resources? We have to think, what kind of resources or goods are we looking at? Ostrom, like economics, looks at the categories of goods: private goods, public goods, club goods. She came up with common pool resources. Each of those has a different definition within economics. Our view is that it's important not to get too categorical here. In understanding the origins of the resources, the character of the resources, the interdependencies of the resources, their attributes in economic terms is important, but that's not the end of the story. We also have to be thinking about who created them and how. What's the role of the legal system in defining the resources? For example, copyright law gives us copyright works. Patent law gives us patents. Data protection law gives us certain kinds of legal protections for data, but to a significant degree, data is in the public domain. Contract law has an important contribution here. Code and how code characterizes in the blockchain space, how code characterizes tokens. Those are computerized creations. They are not simply given as a matter of the physical world. So we can define tokens as we wish. We can define copyrights as we wish. We can define patents as we wish, using tech, using law, using contracts, and so forth. So understand what the resources are. Second, what are the social dilemmas? A social dilemma is a divergence between what individuals prefer and what the group thinks is best for itself. So it's a contrast between individual good and collective good, right? That's where the tragedy of the commons comes in. The tragedy of the commons is a classic example of a social dilemma. One sheep farmer wants to put his sheep or her sheep into the meadow. That's good for that farmer because that sheep gets fed, that sheep gets fed. But it's bad for the community because too many individual farmers doing that with their sheep will deplete the grass. That's why they call it a tragedy of the commons, because what's good for the individual is bad for the group. The tragedy of the commons is one example of a possible social dilemma. And so I've listed in the list here a number of other possible social dilemmas. The challenge here is looking at some group context, what dilemmas, plural, are possibly present. Do we have effective conflict resolution mechanism? Do we have effective privacy mechanisms, if that's the goal? Do we have mechanisms for people to communicate and collaborate with one another? Do we have mechanisms that encourage people to conserve or steward the resource rather than simply use it right now? Do we have mechanisms to make sure that the resources are being produced, not only consumed in appropriate ways? So it's not an exhaustive list of social dilemmas, but it's a pretty good starting list of social dilemmas. And the point is that once you understood the resource, understood what the complications are in terms of how the resources are being produced, stewarded or maintained, stored, and used, right? Third, the community or collective itself, right? So we tend to think of community as kind of a small, limited thing, and it could be, right? Think of the clubhouse that you had as a kid, right? 4 people in a box, 4 people in the tree. But a community can be a big, broad thing. It can be a loose community. It can be a tight-knit community. It can be a very homogeneous community. It can have many, many different kinds of degrees of diversity to it. The key in understanding the attributes of a community is to understand the borders or boundaries, right? How do we know who's in and who's out? Those borders might be more porous. They might be more fixed. There might be criteria for determining who's a member and who's not. There has to be some mechanism for who to be in charge of those decision-making. Is it a collective decision to admit each new person, or is there some subsidiary group that authorizes people to be in? So are there roles within the community, roles and responsibilities? Are there hierarchies? Oftentimes we stereotype communities as being very flat and egalitarian and cooperative, and often that's true, but oftentimes as a practical matter, there are informal, if not always formal, roles and responsibilities. The larger the community gets, you need certain kinds of divisions of labor. Within a community, typically what you expect to see are certain kinds of repeated interactions, people interacting with one another on a repetitive basis. So we have to understand, where are those moments? What are the topics or subjects where people are creating their community because they are interacting on a regular basis? There have to be rules. The community will have rules for good behavior. Those rules for good behavior often will relate to the community's resources, right? So the community is connected to the resource. The community has rules for contributing more resources, drawing resources down or accessing resources, conserving resources, making sure that people don't defect by taking resources and going off and starting their own separate community, right? So there's not a single set of rules that's applicable to all communities. It's simply that in a community with resources, you expect to look for these different kinds of rules. Rules on identity, right? So your membership and participation in the community is partly a matter of your own private identity, material and information that you keep to yourself, and then identity that you share with the others. You have your public-facing identity and you have your private identity, and you have some kind of barrier or boundary that divides one from another. What do people think about this environment again, this oh yay environment? You can see me as the speaker. So this is a version of my public identity, but there's an enormous amount of my private identity that you can't see. And then there's parts of my public identity that you can see if you go looking around social media and the web and so forth, where I've curated my presence in a variety of ways. Again, those are all subject to governance rules on what's acceptable and what's not when people do that. History, culture, values, rituals, customs. I'm going to keep coming back to emphasizing how we need to understand pathways into the present in order to understand what people are doing, right? I've been online since the mid-1990s, and so I have a slightly different set of understandings and beliefs and practices as to my identity and my participation in different communities compared to people who have gotten online in the last 5 years or the last 10 years. And of course, you can take that back further in time. People who entered the IT world and the software world in the 80s or even in the 1970s have a different set of expectations and cultural norms around their participation. And then the last, in terms of defining communities, is technology itself. Right? Technology significantly creates community these days. It's a tool to create community. It's also a tool to define community. It's also often a barrier. Technology can be a barrier in terms of creating community. So again, what we're doing in each context is decoding what technology is doing along with other attributes of the community. The rules themselves, there's lots of different types of rules that we have to pay attention to. Again, formal rules, formally documented rules, informal rules, technologically coded rules, public rules, private rules. There's rules everywhere. There are rules that constitute the group, rules for determining membership, rules for behavioral, positive behavior and negative behavior, conflict resolution rules, rules for changing the rules, rules for determining the infrastructure, the lowest level, the most foundational levels of the rules. How did the rules come to be? Assuming the rules are legitimate rules, how are they made legitimate? Were the rules determined by this group? Or did we acquire or inherit rules that were made by some prior iteration of the group? Think for a moment in terms of the US Constitution. No one alive today was involved in creating the US Constitution. We've inherited the Constitution, acquired it, and assumed its legitimacy through practice, through education, through community engagement, through expert training and advising, through the operation of courts and legislatures over time. We don't spend a ton of time on determining what the Constitution is right now, but we spend a lot of time thinking about what the rules are that operate on top of the Constitution, federal law, and then also thinking about rules at the local level, state laws, practices of individual courts, and so forth. So rules come in a lot of different flavors, and it's important to be very open and inclusive in thinking about how the rules contribute to our overall system of governance. Polycentricity means overlapping governance systems. And so a quick and easy example of polycentricity in the information environment is Wikipedia. Well, Wikipedia is an open system. It's obviously a very robust and sophisticated and complicated system, but notice that there are lots of different governance systems operating simultaneously in an interdependent way, sometimes just adjacent to one another, sometimes in a hierarchical or nested way, right? So Wikipedia is hosted by the Wikimedia Foundation. And so the Wikimedia Foundation provides certain infrastructures and technical constraints, the software and the format and so forth, that drives how Wikipedia is produced and organized. Then you have Wikipedia rules, you have Wikipedia norms for Wikipedians, so the people who are creating and editing entries. There is a governance system that determines when an entry can be created, when it's edited appropriately, rules for resolving conflicts over the content of Wikipedia entries. And then there's copyright, which is operating in the background. Every single contribution to a Wikipedia article is at least potentially copyrightable, and therefore there has to be a licensing mechanism to make sure that all the different combinations of Wikipedia entries, how all the different edits can be coordinated together into the final integrated package. So you've got rule of law, you've got social norms, you've got the Wikipedia hierarchy, you've got the dependence on the Wikimedia system. Those are all elements of the overall governance system. And so I would characterize that as a polycentric system, meaning that in that instance, it functions pretty well, right? Polycentricity often is something that's held up as a useful governance strategy, have multiple coordinated governance systems as a way to deal with complexity, right? The more complex the environment, the more you need multiple governance systems in a good coordinated way. The drawback to polycentricity is that it can slow things down. Too many cooks, too many governance systems can make things problematic, slow. Sometimes you see that in open source software projects. I think of it in the real world as something that you see often when you're thinking about local government. Right? I live in a little suburb here in Pittsburgh. My suburb is part of the county. My suburb and the county are part of the state. And in addition to the various ordinary governments at those levels, you also have school boards and school districts, and water boards and water districts, and you have transportation districts, and you have all kinds of special government authorities. And I don't think Pittsburgh is that unusual relative to a lot of other places in the US. It simply means we have a lot of layers of government, a lot of bureaucracy, and it's complicated and slow to get all those people coordinated in an appropriate way, even while we recognize at some level you have to have local government for local problems, regional government for regional problems, state government for state problems, right? So the polycentricity to all of that is inevitable in some respect, but it creates inefficiency and slows things down. So when we look at polycentricity, we just have to be able to say, I recognize it, I recognize the elements of it, I recognize the costs and the benefits of it. Right? Feedback loops. We've talked about briefly resources, communities, and rules. And when you set those three core elements in motion, what you start to notice when you're studying particular contexts is that the resources and the communities using the governance rules, they create themselves. The Wikipedian community creates Wikipedia. Wikipedia defines the Wikipedian community. There's an obvious feedback loop. The same is true for open source software collectives. And when you start looking beyond Wikipedia and open source and look at other knowledge-dependent collective activities, right? And I'll give you some examples just in a moment, you start to see how we're not necessarily producing outcomes. We're not generating wealth. We're not generating health. We're not generating specific education, although we might be. But we're really sort of circulating the social activity to keep the resource active. Right? I use the common law. Again, I'm a lawyer, so I'm going to look to the law sometimes. The common law, which means ordinary principles of contracts, ordinary principles of property, going back to 13th century England all the way up to the present day. This is what courts use on a bread and butter basis, particularly in state courts when there's a breach of contract lawsuit or there's a trespass lawsuit or something, right? The common law is a very, very rich and deep set of well-accepted basic principles of law that courts modify all the time in incremental ways, right? So the institutions of the law are there to resolve disputes. How do they resolve disputes? By applying, but also evolving the law. So you've got this evolutionary iterative character of the law as a resource, courts and lawyers as the community, those two pieces iterate and evolve so that the common law today is recognizably the same. Contract law is recognizably the same as it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago or 200 years ago. It's the same contract law, but a lot of the details have changed. Why? Because that's the way the common law evolves in that community setting. Last of these checkbox items is outcomes and assessment. This is a big challenge because from an outside perspective, we have a lot of different metrics and there's no single standard way. So economists will look at collective management and governance of knowledge resources, and they'll say, are we looking at social welfare? Or economists might say, are we looking at efficiency? Or some economists and political scientists might say we should be maximizing inputs, capability and opportunity, rather than outputs. Efficiency is an output. Welfare is an output. Capability and opportunity are inputs. Maybe we should be focusing on inputs rather than outcome. Social scientists of other sorts, they focus on equilibrium. Right? Is the system simply stable with acceptable cost? Lawyers will talk about justice, which is something that is not completely different from what economists or philosophers talk about, but lawyers have their own vocabulary for justice. So I just highlight this because we can't take governance for granted. We always should be thinking about whether governance is working. Is it working as intended? Is it generating benefits and costs in an acceptable blend? And according to what metric? Like who says? Is it the group themselves, right? That would be a kind of an equilibrium point of view. Or is it some outside perspective, such as justice or economic efficiency? So that's a pretty lightning fast review of all of the different elements that we've been looking at in our research on governance in knowledge-based environments. Here's a quick summing up of all of that, and then I'll be able to turn quickly to a couple of case studies. Some things to take away from that lightning quick review of governance elements in the knowledge and information environment. One, there is no single best governance strategy that works for every setting, right? These are custom fit, context specific questions. They are based on the empirics of the context, lots of deep questioning and thinking about what's going on in that setting. There's no one size fits all. Things that have always leapt out at me because of the research that we've done: boundary definition, the character of the community, who is in and who is out. How clearly or how vaguely do we define those boundaries? Nesting and polycentricity, multiple governance systems in a complex environment. Those are valuable strategies, nesting or polycentricity, but too much polycentricity, too much nesting can get you in trouble. It can slow you down too quickly. Understanding the interrelationship between immaterial or intangible knowledge assets and tangible physical resources. Right? Understanding the role of infrastructures. Sometimes we think of platforms, but I don't want to limit this just to platforms. Infrastructures can take a lot of different forms. The idea is that there are low layers that are foundational and fundamental to a lot of specific activities going up on top. Many, many different kinds of roles and rules on who participates and how. History and culture are really influential. You're really going to miss things if you don't understand history and culture and what to do with them. It's not that we have to follow history or simply accept culture, but be aware of how they influence what's going on right now. Shared values. History and culture are ways to understand goals and endpoints as expressions of shared values and feedback loops. So let me transition quickly. I've got about 10 minutes to go here. Well, I see a question. Let me pause here. Aaron in the chat asks, do you see any difference between governance of hierarchy or overlapping circles, or is that distinction manifest as the same power dynamic? And then another question from Aaron, what's the best way for us to pass down history, culture, and values? So on the first, governance of hierarchy and overlapping circles, well, I guess I'm always going to come back to context and say, so in the abstract, yes, there's a difference between hierarchy and overlapping circles, but in practice, they often go together, and they often go together in complicated ways. And so maybe I'll get into some of that in the examples I'm going to turn to in a second. But I'm always going to turn back to empirics rather than try to dive into a broader, more conceptual question. And the best way to pass down history, cultures, and values, there's a simple answer that doesn't really help, which is to say, with great care. Right. I live in Pittsburgh. I grew up in California. I grew up in the Bay Area in Silicon Valley. And one of the things, for those of you who know California and the Valley, is that Californians are trained to be pretty indifferent to history and culture. That's both its great strength and its great limitation. Is California is almost systematically ignorant and purposely ignorant of what happened last year, let alone in the last decade or the last century. Pittsburgh, I discovered when I moved here, is so far on the other end of that spectrum, it's not even funny. Pittsburgh is one of these cities that is obsessed with where you went to high school. And if you don't know where, the street corner stores were 50 years ago, then you're going to miss all the key conversational cues. And that kind of history and culture manifests in social networks and opportunity, even in the contemporary startup business space, for example. So history and culture, you have to understand what they're doing. The other layer of Pittsburgh culture, for those of you who know American culture, is the Pittsburgh Steelers, American football. Which, whether you're a football fan or not, if you don't understand the Steelers and their history, you are going to miss out on half of everything that happens in Pittsburgh. You just have to have a certain basic cultural awareness. That does not mean you need to accept it. That does not mean that you need to bake it into your daily life or your business plan or your volunteerism. It simply means that there are landmines out there. There are strengths. There are community strengths. The Steelers culture is a source of great community strength. You don't simply want to accept it and swim with it. You want to use it in constructive ways. Last question from Aaron, then I'll cut on to the case studies. What historical example? Okay, what example? Like the empiric. So that's a good transition. So to my case studies. Well, you'll judge for yourself whether they're good or not, but they're always going to have strengths and weaknesses. So I've got three. I'll try to hit them very quickly. One is something I've written a lot about: the university, higher education. Universities, like the idea of a formal separate entity for higher education, goes back 1,000 years to Italy, to France, to Germany. It got transformed when it migrated to England, and then transformed again when it came to the US in the 1800s. And I've got pictures of Cambridge, picture of Stanford, and a picture of my law school, which is this awful brutalist concrete building at the University of Pittsburgh. Right. So universities are about knowledge, right? That's the resource. How do we produce it, store it, transmit it in a lot of productive ways, but keeping our finger on the pulse of the kind of broad concept of knowledge. And the idea of a university is that a university is a kind of autonomous institution. It's not simply a marketplace environment. It's not simply a state provided or government supplied thing. Knowledge, of course, goes with things like money, opportunity, status, right? Universities are very, very complicated things. There's a lot of different strategies in different countries at different times. What does a university look like in the US? Very complicated question itself. Different in the UK today, different in Europe, different in Asia, different in Australia. But there's a shared core. You've got kind of a common spine, if you will, to what we think of as a university. Universities are largely self-governed, at least in concept. They are largely not dependent for their direction on state or government support, although that's increasingly a complicated question. They are largely closed off. They are largely elite environments. And again, that's a very complicated question. Technology, in many respects, is changing those conditions. So back to Aaron's question, I think there's been a lot of success over the centuries in passing down some of the core concepts that animate the idea of the university as a separate place that we trust with developing and sharing knowledge. But it's getting to be a very complicated, tense space for reasons having to do with money, involvement of the government, access on a broad basis, the elite status, the closed status of the university. Can technology solve those problems? Maybe. Technology is in some respects making those problems worse. Right. So the university has been very adaptable over the centuries, given this core interest. Has it been successful? I'll leave that all to you to decide based on your own personal experiences and those that you know elsewhere as students or faculty members or allies or partners or in conflict sometimes perhaps with universities. But I think that's a very interesting knowledge sharing, knowledge governance institution. Here's my second one, the private sector itself, which we think of as a space of self-interest, right? Contracts is all about my negotiating over my self-interest with your self-interest. And if we come to a mutually beneficial agreement, we have a deal. Those might be classic written contracts. They might be handshake deals. Today, they might be baked into something in code. The interesting thing about markets and market capitalism is that there are shared knowledge infrastructures underneath the marketplace. Like the market doesn't work unless we've got a reasonable amount of education and information for people to understand their interests and understand what they might be able to do. Security of contract. We've got legal systems that largely protect the security of agreed upon deals. We have freedom in many instances for people to choose what's best for themselves. Right? All of those are shared resources, intangible resources that come through politics, they come through education. They are all infrastructural layers. They might exist in social dynamics. They might exist in technology systems and so forth. It's been incredibly successful and powerful over time, going back to, depending on how you date, the origins of market capitalism, again, with a lot of adaptation and change through the centuries, but it's been an incredible wealth driver. Again, technology is changing a lot of those conditions, in some instances for the better, in some instances for the worse. So you can decide whether the infrastructural shared governance aspects of market capitalism are successful or not. They have survived and they are in many ways thriving, but there's a lot of challenge, some people would say a lot of threat. Last example, I'll close with this. This is one I'd love to talk about, but I only have about a minute and a half, is international soccer. Full confession, I'm a huge soccer person. I've been a soccer person going back to the 1960s. I am that old. But you can think about soccer, both the play of soccer and also the business of soccer, the entertainment value of soccer, the competitive value of soccer, recreational soccer, all of its different attributes, as the cultural dimensions of soccer, as a polycentric governance system that's been extremely robust with changes for 150 years since it got organized formally, and of course centuries since soccer or football was created as a kind of communal festival sport in England, Scotland, and northern France. So again, what soccer teaches, and the pictures here are the Icelanders. This is from the 2016 European Championship, when Iceland, which as you all know is this tiny, tiny country with no particular tradition of soccer success. 2016, Iceland goes to the European Championship in France and has this spectacular run of success against much bigger countries and more successful countries. And they celebrate by basically convening the entire country of Iceland in Reykjavik to do what they call the Viking clap, to sort of use soccer and the cultural identity of the island to solidify the Icelanders' national identity, soccer identity as a thing. All the while, of course, everybody is fully aware of all of the corruption that operates at the international FIFA level and elsewhere. There are complications of funding pro soccer in England and France and Italy in particular, with oligarch money and money out of the Middle East, which has really done awful things to the game. But it's an interesting exercise to take soccer as an instance of a collectively managed governance institution that is polycentric: field, stadium, community, league, global, with complications, international business, historical cultures, and so forth, branding and licensing, the trademark elements to soccer, which are so critical to how it operates today. Is soccer better or worse for all of that evolution and change? people can disagree in all kinds of interesting ways. That's why it's worth a full hour of conversation some other time. But it's endured. Back to Aaron's point, history, culture, values have been passed down, not in a not in a rigid way, but in an adaptable way. And sometimes the adaptations are productive and good, and sometimes the adaptations and fluidity are less beneficial. I've written a couple of pieces recently about these knowledge commons governance concepts applied to blockchain. So their links are here and on my website, and we could talk about that at a later time, I'm sure. And just to close the last slide, here I am in my last minute this morning. It's really important, I think, when we're talking about governance, to be asking a lot of very detailed questions, not asking them in a random way, which is why I have the bulleted list of different categories, but to ask these questions in a systematic way. What's the goal of governance? Why governance? Why governance historically? Why governance today? Why governance is needed relative to some community, relative to some resource. Understanding history and precedent is important, but so many of our precedents are drawn from environments where we think in terms of physical resources. We don't have as much practice thinking in terms of knowledge, data, information, IT infrastructures. So that's why it's important to learn from history, but also to be open to novelty. Do the answers to the questions matter so much that we just go through the process of asking and discussing the questions? I'm not 100% sure what motivates the question, but if you look at the case studies, the process of asking and discussing the questions turns out to be a driver of your imagination. So what you're trying to figure out in a given case is what's working and why, what's not working and why, and what can we abstract from that in order to use it in other settings, right? So one case study by itself often doesn't tell you a lot. That's why we've done a number of books with a lot of different case studies. What you're trying to do is generalize over time from data from multiple different environments. Okay, perfect. I'm going to stop. I think I'm out of time. Amori, who's the facilitator, is in charge of my time. I know that we're going to take a break and then come